Hello again. This isn't really part of the lockdown specials. It's a story that I mentioned during 617 Squadron's history, and it's also part of my history of Bomber Command. This one is a story that I wanted to tell. It may not be a story that you want to hear. I will not be fazed in any way if you skip this one, but it is a story that probably touched most of our lives. Be aware, some of the images used are not pleasant, and the story does not end well. It is, however, history. The first people to bomb cities were the Germans, using Zeppelin and Schultz airships. These airships were first designed to carry out reconnaissance over the horizon for the German Navy, but it was soon found that they carried a small bomb load and could travel over much of England to release their bombs. Even though the bomb loads were light and the damage caused by the attacks was limited, the effect on morale was significant, and it was said to be reducing the population's will to fight. The pretense, even in this early stage, was that the targets were all of only military importance. The effects of the raid were almost always seen as much more damaging and dramatic than they actually were. However, eventually, air and ground defences began to bring down these slow, ponderous machines, and even strong winds could destroy the airships either on the ground or cause them to crash. The effectiveness of the weapon was being lost. Many of them finished up as burnt-out skeletons. But the Germans had anticipated these losses and had, even before the war, been designing long-range heavy bombers. The Gotha bombers paid regular visits to London, firstly during daylight hours, and then as the defences got the better of them, they switched to night bombing. Zeppelin also had a bomber, a large heavyweight that could carry more bombs than the Gotha bomber, but was much more expensive to operate, and even at night, the night fighters could sometimes find them and give them a nasty surprise. When Marshal Trenchard took over the Royal Air Force, he was delighted to find that heavy bombers were on the line for the Royal Air Force as well. The Vickers Vimy, the Handley Page 0400, and then later the larger Handley Page V1500 were on the drawing board and ready to fly. But unfortunately, the armistice occurred before Trenchard was able to get his heavy bombers into an attack position. Between the war, developments in bombing caused most people to believe that the bomber would always get through. General Guillaume Douhet was the first person to express this in a book that he wrote on strategic air offensives, and the idea was taken up by Stanley Baldwin in the Houses of Parliament. The main reason for this view was the speed that most bombers were able to achieve. The Bristol Blenheim could outstrip most of the fighters that even the RAF were fielding at the time. The Italians had the Savio Marchetti, and the Germans had the Heinkel 111, the Schnell bomber. And it was the Germans who first tested the theory of the bomber will always get through by bombing the small town in Spain, Guernica. During the Spanish Civil War, the Luftwaffe was testing its weapons in Messerschmitts, Heinkels and Junkers against the Republican Army of Spain. Guernica was a test bed that resulted in the bombing of the town. It was commemorated by Pablo Picasso with one of his inimitable frescoes. The Germans then went on to use their bombing tactics in the famous Blitzkrieg, bombing firstly Warsaw and then Rotterdam. The attack on Rotterdam was made after the peace had been signed, but the Germans said that they could not recall their aircraft. And then the bombing on London. The Germans never needed a strategic bomber. All German bombers were medium-fast tactical bombers. They were intended as long-range artillery to support the army during a Blitzkrieg campaign. The Heinkel 111 carried a standard bomb load of 4,500 pounds. This could be increased to 8,000 pounds, but in the Battle of Britain, the 8,000 pound bomb load could only be carried as far as Kent. The bombers could not reach London or certainly further inland with a heavier bomb load than 4,500 pounds. The Germans also used the dive bomber, the Junkers 88, which carried a conventional bomb load of 3,000 pounds, and this could be upped to 6,600 pounds by external bomb racks, but again the speed and range were drastically reduced. And the Dornier 17, which by the Battle of Britain even was beginning to be an obsolete bomber and only carried 2,200 pounds of bombs conventionally and 4,000 pounds if it was attached under the wings. These bomb loads, even by the rules of the day, were quite light. The RAF returned the attack to the Germans, flying aircraft such as the Wellington and also the Handley Page Hampden. But everyone was using medium bombers, which are fast, but not fast enough to escape the modern fighters such as the Spitfire, the Hurricane and the Messerschmitt 109, and only carrying a relatively light bomb load. With the effectiveness of a raid being measured in tons of bombs dropped, the bombs dropped by the Germans gradually increased with the raids they were making. This was because they used more bombers, and those bombers flew more sorties on a given target. The London Blitz were worse than any of the raids on Rotterdam and 16 times worse than Guernica. But already in the chair is Air Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, and he makes a promise to the Germans. They have sown the wind, they will now reap the whirlwind. Air Marshal Portal, Harris's boss, after the Butt report, which some of you remember, said that 1 bomb in 3 fell within 5 miles of the target when RAF bombers attacked Germany, Air Chief Marshal Portal decides that the RAF must convert to area bombing by night. The government and the Joint Chiefs of Staff all agree with this policy, and area bombing by night becomes the method of the RAF operations. Air Marshal Arthur Harris agrees with this with a passion. Trenchard's view of the bloody paralyzer bomber had been thought about during the interwar period, and new bombers were coming on stream which were capable of carrying much heavier bomb loads over much longer distances. The first of these was the Sterling, with a 14,000 pound bombing capability. Then came the Halifax, slightly less, 13,000 pounds of bombs, but could take it for a longer distance. And finally, the famous Lancaster, which by the end of the war could carry 22,000 pounds of bombs. That's 10 tons of bombs. The British have developed a strong force of 4-engine bombers, and this time they were developed and manufactured and issued to Bomber Command in good time to be deployed. So this is Harris's Whirlwind. They also flew Wellington bombers along with the heavies, because the Wellington stayed in frontline operations until well into the war, with a 6,000 pound bomb load due to operated engines, and even the Mosquito, which was classified as a fighter but also had a bombing version that was capable of carrying 4,500 pounds of bombs into Berlin itself. Two philosophies developed with the Allies during the war. The Royal Air Force carried heavy bomb loads with little protection in the aircraft, flying at night and bombing in areas. The United States Army Air Force preferred a light bomb load with heavy protection in their aircraft, daylight precision bombing. The B-17 Flying Fortress could carry 8,000 pounds of bombs on a short-range mission, but on a long-range mission, for instance going to Berlin, it could only carry 4,000 pounds of bombs. The B-24 Liberator wasn't much better, with only 5,000 pounds on long-range missions, although again it could carry 8,000 pounds on a short-range target. The Americans took protection of their aircraft much more seriously. A Royal Air Force bomber would carry 6 to 8 .303 machine guns. The United States Air Force bomber would carry 11 to 14 .5-inch machine guns, and you can see the ammunition comparison. Carrying these many guns and the ammunition weighing that much more reduced the bomb load in the American aircraft, but allowed them to fly during the daytime. The war being fought by Bomber Command up to mid-1941 was a tit-for-tat exchange of blows, firstly affected by the British ban on damaging private property, and then affected by the strength of enemy fighter defences, where we lost all the advantages and suffered all the setbacks of the German Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain. Air Marshal Harris believes he now has a weapon to win the war. The London Blitz, and more importantly the raid on Coventry, did shake British morale. There was considerable open rebellion against politicians and particularly against the government. It was British democracy at work, and the antagonism didn't last long. It perhaps led to the wrong conclusions. A serious statistical analysis said it took 1 ton of bombs to kill 1 German, and for every German killed, an airman lost his life. The idea was that heavy bombing to the point of completely destroying Germany's major cities would cause the German people to overthrow the leadership. It became government policy to try to wipe out every city with more than 100,000 in the population. It's hard to say if what happens next is a legitimate exchange of fire in wartime, or if it is one of the greatest war crimes of the 20th century. The further away from it we get in time, the worse it becomes, as more information is made available. But should a war be judged with 2020 hindsight? Air Marshal Harris makes delivering the policy of city annihilation his obsession. Air Marshal Harris's obsession is actually an act of self-defense. The policy is to wipe out every city with more than 100,000 population. But if Harris adopts this plan, then others who have handed the policy down to him can say he enacted the policy beyond their wishes. From now until the end of the war, Harris will resist any attempt to divert Bomber Command from the mission of annihilating the cities in Germany, and this even applies to 617 Squadron's attack on the Ruhr dams, the famous dam busters. This mission starts with an attack on Hamburg. The city-busting policy starts on the 24th of July 1943 with the destruction of the city of Hamburg, Operation Gomorrah. On May 10th, 1941, the Luftwaffe put a maximum effort raid on London, delivering 711 metric tons of bombs. A little over a year later, the RAF put in a maximum raid on Cologne, with slightly more than double the bomb weight delivered. From now on, the weight of bomb load delivered will be the measure of Allied bombing successes. Operation Gomorrah was a joint attack by the RAF and the United States Army Air Force on the Hanseatic port city of Hamburg. It was scheduled to last for 6 nights, starting on the 24th of July with the United States Air Force bombing during the days. Window strip of aluminium foil is used to confuse the enemy's radar defences for the first time. H2S and oboe are used to help navigation and target the bombing concentrations. The city was ringed with anti-aircraft and radar defences, and around the city that should be able to pick up the enemy bombers at 100 miles away and give warning, but the window and the H2S and oboe devices meant that this hardly happened. This raid was not planned as an equivalent to Coventry. Goebbels had coined the term Coventration to suggest the destruction of Coventry, but Gomorrah was a scientifically planned attempt to wipe out a city with maximum effect. The raid came in with very little warning for the 250,000 inhabitants. The Pathfinders actually flew with the bomber stream and only marked the targets minutes before the attack began. Bombs were dropped in a patterned sequence to cause maximum damage and loss of life. Between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m., 2,300 tons of bombs were dropped, which included 35,000 incendiary bombs. 15,000 people were killed and many more were wounded. The Pathfinders dropped incendiaries to illuminate the target. The main bulk of the attack then followed. Firstly, a wave of aircraft dropping 200-pound high-explosive bombs to blast out doors, windows, walls and roofs to spread the fire. Then a massive attack of incendiary bombs to start and increase the fires. Then more high explosives, 500-pound bombs, intended as property destroyers and an anti-personnel element against firefighters and rescue workers. This made any attempt to fight the fires and control the damage useless. The city burned. This was bombing to a carefully devised plan intended to heap destruction onto destruction. The planned alternation of high explosive and incendiary resulted in the first firestorms ever created by bombing. The fires were so fierce they sucked air out of the underground shelters and pulled a gale-force wind. Many people suffocated in the shelters, and many others were dragged into the flames by the gale. B-17s of the 8th Air Force came in the next day to make what they described as a precision bombing attack on harbour and port facilities, but their bombs simply added to the destruction of the city. The installations the Americans were bombing were known to be too close to the city centre to avoid widespread collateral damage. And the precise box formations spread bombs more widely than the United States Army Air Force ever acknowledged in public. The idea was that the aircraft tied up in a tight formation and bombed when the leader released his bombs, but the formations were hardly ever tight enough, and the bomb spread was wider than planned. And casualties on both sides were in far greater numbers than the public was allowed to know at the time. And despite the widespread damage, the rage went on with the same intensity for 2 more nights and 1 more day, spread over the week. Even the German High Command, who had praised the German Blitz campaigns, were surprised by what happened to Hamburg. The city was all but annihilated. 80% of its industrial capacity was ruined, and 85% of the remaining population fled into the countryside around. The city was a deserted ruin. An official communiqué published shortly after the war agrees the destruction. But it did not break the morale of the German people, though the German High Command feared it might. It badly disrupted the work of the city, and Hamburg never really recovered until the end of the war. But if anything, it stiffened the resolve of those who witnessed and survived the devastation. As with the Blitz of Coventry and London, it eventually gave people something to fight against. Hundreds of aircraft took part in the raid. This one is taking off from RAF Syerston. Syerston had Lancasters at this time and put up a maximum effort for the Hamburg raids. The following quote from a BBC TV programme explains what maximum effort meant in the target area. Katie Hofmeister, 19, was trying to escape the furnace her Hamburg neighbourhood had become. I struggled to run against the wind in the middle of the street. I could not go on across the road because the asphalt had melted. There were people on the roadway, some already dead, some still lying alive but stuck in the asphalt. They must have rushed onto the roadway without thinking. Their feet have got stuck and they have put out their hands to try to get out. They were on their hands and knees and screaming. What was a maximum effort? On the night of the 24th and 25th of July 1943, 791 heavy bombers attacked Hamburg. 12 were lost, 1.5%. During the 25th of July, the United States Army Air Force attacked with 76 B-17s. 15 were lost. On the night of the 26th-27th of July, 6 Mosquitoes continued the attack but had no losses. Then on the 27th and 28th of July, 787 heavy bombers attacked. 14 were lost, a loss rate of 1.7%. On the night of the 29th and 30th of July, the Royal Air Force arranged its third heavy bombing attack with 777 bombers. 28 were lost, a loss rate of 3.6%. The weight of bombs dropped on Hamburg, compared with London's Blitz, is almost 3 times as much. The casualties are 15 times as great. In the grim arithmetic of Bomber Command, the casualty ratio is about 80-1 in favour of the RAF. And for every 1 ton of bombs, the RAF has killed approximately 1,000 people. An improvement on their 1940 statistics, which, if you remember, said 1 ton of bombs for 1 enemy killed at a cost of 1 airman. Now I have the weapon to win the war, was Harris's opinion. Harris saw Operation Gomorrah as a signpost to future bombing campaigns. The same night-day attacks hit every major city in Germany over the next couple of years. Berlin suffered a continual bombardment, interrupted only for the Normandy campaign. The pinnacle was Dresden in February 1945. and Dresden, the policy went too far. Churchill, Eisenhower, Stalin, even Hap Arnold, who was Commander-in-Chief of the 8th Army Air Force, all denied any knowledge of the Dresden debacle. Harris and Bomber Command took the blame. The attack on Dresden, the 13th and 14th of February 1945, had the codename Operation Point Blank. 769 RAF Lancasters, 9 RAF Mosquitoes as medium bombers, 527 United States Army Air Force B-17s, and 784 American Mustang fighters reduced Dresden to this. The RAF lost 6 Lancasters, 42 crew members killed. The Americans lost 1 B-17 bomber, 10 crew members killed. The German losses amounted to 25,000 killed, 18,500 wounded. The raid was always intended to maximize the casualties. The RAF attacked in 2 waves, 3 hours apart, in order to catch rescue workers in the open and increase the damage. They also attacked 3 other cities in Germany at the same time to confuse the enemy defences. Such was the superiority of air power for the Allies. The Americans supported the chaos by attacking on the following day, the 14th of February, with high explosive and incendiary loads, and their Mustang fighters also strafed soft targets in the city, including pedestrians on the street. After the war, the Americans were critical of Britain's bombing annihilation policy, but in late 1944-45, the United States Army Air Force under Curtis LeMay brought strategic bombing to a new crescendo. Openly copying and improving on Harris's tactics, LeMay, firstly with night area firebombing missions on 20 Japanese towns, and a concentrated attack on Tokyo that caused more than 100,000 casualties, and then 2 atomic bombs delivered on Hiroshima and Nagasaki for future effect. The Americans actually admitted that they were interested to see what effect atomic bombs had on a city, and they hoped that it would act as a deterrent to the Russians, who were beginning to rattle their saber. The American actions were justified by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. But LeMay, as head of Strategic Air Command, was prepared to support MacArthur's wish to nuke the North Koreans. The morality of war is always difficult to define, and often impossible to agree. I have worked with several people who took part in the Hamburg raid and flew with Bomber Command. Knowing my interest in military history, they were prepared to talk with me about it. No one regretted it at the time. History gave them a different opinion, but they all thought they were helping to win the war and that the Germans deserved everything they got. Not because of the concentration camps. That knowledge came later and made it feel like a just war. Simply because the Germans started it. The lack of a national memorial and a campaign medal affected them all. For all the ones I knew, the National Memorial to Bomber Command came too late. None of them felt like war criminals. All of them felt some regret. To paraphrase Kipling, dare not a flyer knew someone had blundered into the shadow of death, into the mouth of hell, rode 55,000 airmen of Bomber Command killed in World War II. 55,573 to be precise. If you got this far, thank you for watching. There will be more programs to come, and I promise that most of those will be more cheerful. And we are still open for requests. Look forward to seeing you all again as soon as we're able. Goodbye now.